This video is a double feature covering the analog drum machine Boom Chick and the analog mixer assembler, both coming from the partnership between Pittsburgh Modular and Cre8Audio. Boom Chick is a 5-voice, 6-track drum machine. The open and closed hats share the same voice. It's purely based on analog drum synthesis, though it has a digital sequencer to trigger different voices, with a couple of fun generative options, and it also supports MIDI sync. Assembler is a stereo analog mixer with 15 inputs in various configurations of mono, stereo, and return inputs, 3 mono sends, mute and cue controls, analog gain boost, and 2 of its tracks have analog EQ circuits. Both come in standalone cases with a power supply, but can also be used in a Eurorack setup. In this video, I'll take a look at both, along with pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Pittsburgh and Cre8 sent me these instruments. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, where you'll also find a sample pack with plenty of Boom Chick sounds. Okay, let's start with Boom Chick. From a sound design perspective, it's a mostly knob per function analog drum synth. It's got 5 voices, where the hats choke each other, but the others can play simultaneously. It's mono only, but has separate outputs for each of the voices, so you can pan and process them any way you like, as I'll show you later, on an external mixer, of course. I say mostly knob per function because some of the parameters have digital control, but not too many. And then beside that, it has a digital sequencer where you can step sequence or play live into it, both quantized and unquantized. Each of the 6 tracks can have up to 64 steps across 4 pages, and they can each run at different clock divisions. Besides sequencing manually, it also has a Euclidean sequencer and an interesting generative sequencer. You can store up to 64 sequences on board, but what's stored in sequences is just the triggers, not any of the sound design parameters. So there are no sound design presets, and you can't automate the sound design controls, just the triggers. In terms of general workflow, you either step sequence or play live using the buttons, and then there are a bunch of screens or modes which you enter by holding the edit button and pressing one of these buttons. So for example, if I wanted to enter the generative sequencing mode, I'd press this, and now the lights light up differently to represent different things. To exit one of these screens, just press the edit button again. When you want to edit parameters, say for example swing or humanize, you press shift and the parameter name, and then either turn the knob and you'll see its value, the swing value in this case, change here, or you can press these buttons too. When you're done changing the setting, again, press edit to get out of this screen. And then one more bit of workflow. When you hold the edit button, you'll see an overview of what's going on with the sequencer or different settings based on the red labels under the buttons. So for example, if you see these little red mute icons, if you hold edit, you can mute tracks or mute all. So holding edit shows you, for example, the mute status, but it also shows you the tempo rate, and you can tap tempo into here. And other LEDs will pretty much show you things that are related to their label. So these will light up if track lengths or divisions aren't set to the default, and they'll blink if different tracks have different length or division settings. In terms of build, Boom Chick feels very solid. The enclosure is plastic. The knobs are clearly cramped, but have a good feel and are fairly solid. The buttons also feel fine. They're not velocity sensitive, and you can't program velocity or ghost notes into the sequencer. In terms of connectivity, the inputs are red and outputs are white. You've got triggers for each of the tracks and separate audio output for each of the tracks. If you plug a jack into one of these outputs, it'll be taken away from the main output, which is a good thing. Then you've got MIDI in and out, clock sync with reset, again both in and out. MIDI is TRS-A as it should be, and it comes with one little DIN MIDI adapter dongle. It comes with a power supply, but you can also take it out of its case and mount it in a Eurorack case. Okay, let's dive in and take a listen to its individual voices, and I'll start with a kick. Let's play you some kick sounds. You've got control over pitch and drive. And the decay time, going from a single click to long decays. So that's pretty much it for the kick track. Then there's the snare track. Before I play how it sounds for you, I did want to say that it has a, to me at least, noticeable noise floor where noise comes in from drum 1 and from the system generally. So it's fairly faint. I think it's about 60 dB below the actual snare sound or the peak of the snare sound. But you can sort of hear it in the background. And even if I turn the level of this down all the way, it still bleeds in. I asked Pittsburgh about this and they said this is what it is. So it's really up to you whether you find this acceptable or not. Anyway, let's listen to the snare. It's got tone control, noise, down to a click, and of course decay. And that is pretty much it for the snare. I'll lower its level so it doesn't interfere with hearing the other drums. Moving on, let's take a listen to the FM drums. These two voices are identical. The manual states it's a reimagining of the classic Pollard syndrome. I've never tried that one, but I think this is very versatile. Let's first turn down the FM mod depth. It's basically 2 oscillator FM. So for the main oscillator, the carrier, you've got pitch control and waveform control from sine to a square. And there are sweep options, pitch envelope basically. With up and down, but also changes the core pitch or where it ends up. At noon, there's no pitch envelope. And things get much more interesting when we bring in the second oscillator, which is our modulator, by increasing FM depth. So, when its pitch or mod rate is low, you can actually hear it. Change the pitch of the carrier at different rates. It's not in sync with when you press. And it goes into nice audio rates. And you can choose the modulator's waveform. You do that by holding Edit or Shift and pressing this button. So you've got anywhere from a triangle to saw, square, noise, and a mix of both. So this has both fun LFO rate shenanigans, but also significant audio rate mod options. And there are a ton of sweet spots here based on the waveform. Very metallic, of course. And FM mod depth has a bunch of nice analog sweet spots. Coarse noise. So all in all, I think a very versatile and interesting analog FM voice. Let's move on to the hats. You've got closed hat and open hats, pitch control, again for both. The only difference is the decay time. And a filter, high pass filter. and decay control. And the open hat has a variable parameter for its length. If you hold Shift, you can edit its length. So those are the core sounds of Boom Chick. Moving on, Boom Chick has two stop modes. The first time you press stop, it doesn't really stop transport. Rather, this keeps on going if you've got another device in sync, and when you press play again, it'll pick up on the next loop based on the longest track. So you need to press stop twice to totally stop transport. Okay, let's move on and talk about sequencing. I'll start with a blank sequence. You can either step sequence or play live into the step sequencer. You can change the length of one or all of the tracks with Shift and length. If you extend a track's length using length, it'll extend with empty steps. And if you extend with extend, it'll pad the steps based on the previous bars. Let's go for a simple 16-step sequence. Hit edit to escape. Anyway, in step mode, you just pick a track and play steps on the timeline. So fairly easy. Beside that, you can also live record into a sequence. So I can practice, and when I'm ready to record, press record. Record live into the sequencer. Live recording is always unquantized. You can hold a note if you like and change its step shift, its micro timing, forwards or backwards. This will be a temporary change if you don't have record on, and permanent if you have record on. Like I mentioned, you can have the tracks run at different speeds or time divisions. So maybe if I make the snares a little bit more sparse, and then let's remove these so everything will be very clear and only have hats. So if I go into Shift and division, I can change the time division for any selected tracks by turning this knob or by pressing this. Since all the tracks are selected, the slowdown is global, but it is tempo synced, say, to an external beat. So that's relative time divisions. You can add rolls, which are ratchets per step. So if we go into roll mode, we can hold the step and then add different ratchets on a per step basis. This also works in live mode, by the way. So you can just press this button and record that live into the pattern, which has now become pretty crazy. If you want, by the way, you can clear rolls like this. Another per step feature is chance, which lets you set conditions where a step won't necessarily trigger each loop of the sequencer. So that we can hear this, let's maybe just focus on the snare for a bit. So this is our core beat. Let's say that we wanted this snare to not trigger every loop. If we go into chance mode, then we've got two options. The first is probability-based skipping. So this is 0 probability of skipping, and this is, I guess, halfway there. So if we hit play, you'll see that this snare won't always trigger based on the probability. And then another chance option is repeat conditions. So if I go beyond the percentage probabilities into the next screen, you'll see I've got an option to trigger once every certain number of times. So sort of consider this as a kind of split screen where the last 8 steps show you the total number of repeats. So in this case, say 3 repeats, 4 repeats, 2 repeats, or let's go for 3 repeats. Then the first 8 LEDs will show you on which of the loops it'll trigger. So the first, second, or third loop. So let's take a listen to this in action. First loop doesn't trigger. Second loop doesn't trigger. Third loop it triggers. Next up, Boom Chick has a few interesting timing features. There's swing. This is per channel. I selected the closed hats. And there's humanize, which messes up the timing completely as if I played it live. And there's quantize, which is the opposite. So quantize will take messy playing and straighten it out. Since I step sequence these, you won't hear this. So if you played live sloppily, that still gets stored, but quantize will sort it out if you want. Moving on, let's take a listen to the generative sequencers. We'll start with the Euclidean sequencer, and let's maybe listen to the FM drum doing that. So we don't have any steps programmed for this drum currently. If we go into Shift or Edit and Euclidean, we can choose the number of triggers, and then when I release this, these will be programmed into the pattern. Record needs to be on for this to work. And then there's a generative sequencer, which will come up with triggers either for one track or for all of them. So let's go wild and bring levels back up here. I'll choose an empty sequence. You enter the generative sequencer by holding Shift and GenSec. Choose the tracks you want to generate triggers for. Let's do all of them. And then there are 4 groups of generative sequencing types. This group is called unsyncopated, this group is called syncopated, this group weird, and this group mathy. And then within a group, you've got 4 levels of complexity. So let's start with unsyncopated, no complexity. Record needs to be on, hit edit to exit, and this is our beat. We go ahead and change it all if we like. Let's go for full complexity. Okay, it changes, by the way, on the next loop. Let's go again to simple, syncopated. Let's try something else. Go for more complexity. Again, syncopated. Let's see what weird does. Weird level 3. And let's go for mathy. Mathy 2. So this could be a start for something. So I think we covered most of the important things. There are a few other miscellaneous items. There's a song mode, which lets you chain sequences. And there's a clear button that lets you initialize various things across the synth. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Boom Chick. On the pros side are its small form factor with plenty of hands-on controls and several very interesting generative sequencing options to spice things up. The FM drums are very versatile. The Euclidean and generative sequencers are fun, and there's support for micro-timing and per-channel time divisions. Of course, the meat of the action is the analog drums. That's really a matter of taste, of what you prefer, compared to drum machines with samples or multiple digital synthesis engines. While the FM drum machines are fun and surprising, I think the rest of its sounds have a relatively limited timbral range. There are quite a few alternatives at this price range and lower, including various Volca drum machines, the T8 from Roland, Uno Drum, Drum Brute Impact, Seek Track, Electron Model Samples and Cycles, and then at a slightly higher price there are Novation's Circuits and Roland's TR6S. Comparing to those, on the cons side, beside the timbral range, another thing to be aware of is that your sound settings aren't saved along with the sequences, and there's no automation of sound design parameters in the sequencer. This, for example, is similar to another analog drum machine in this price range, the Drum Brute Impact, as opposed to most of the digital ones where you can save sounds and automate them in the sequencer. Other cons, Boom Chick doesn't have velocity-sensitive pads like some of its competitors, but not all. It doesn't have any built-in effects, though it does have separate outputs for external processing. Finally, on the cons side, first, I found the red print hard to read in non-well-lit environments as opposed to this one. And there's the bleed of noise and the FM drum into the snare. You need to decide whether this bothers you or not. Okay, so that was Boom Chick. Let's talk about Assembler. I'll start with an overview. It's an analog mixer with 15 inputs, 3 mono sends. Even though the inputs are mostly mono, Assembler is a stereo mixer. You've got pans for the first 6 tracks. The last 4 tracks are intended to be stereo tracks, so they don't have any panning, and the returns for the first 2 effect slots are in stereo as well. It has mute options both for the main outputs and for the headphones, for the Q outputs. Everything is pretty much knob per function except maybe these buttons, which bring up different behaviors for the track buttons. So by default, these control mutes for the main outputs, and then by holding these as kind of a shift, You mute tracks for the Q output. You control 20 dB gain for each of the main tracks, not for the returns. And this button lets you use them to control auxiliaries. More on that in a bit. Inputs are labeled in blue, outputs in white. Level knobs are in blue. This is for the main output. This is for the Q or phone's output. Let's dive in a little bit deeper. Assembler has a few different channel configurations. The first two channels have EQ controls, low and high. The low EQ adds up to 12 dB below 200 Hertz, or removes 12 dB of bass. And the high EQ adds 12 dB above 2500 Hertz, or subtracts 12 dB. And of course, panning works. So those are the first two tracks. The next four tracks are mono tracks and they're identical. No EQ controls, just panning and sends, which we'll talk about in a bit. But these tracks, like the first two, have two send knobs. Then the last four tracks are grouped as stereo tracks. They only have one send, which you can send to your choice of one of the three effects, and a level control as well. And you can also plug mono sources into these two tracks, like I have here. So with one jack, it's just normal both to the left and to the right. So that's how the main 10 mix inputs are handled. Then you've got 3 sends and returns. The sends are all mono sends. And returns, like I mentioned, 2 stereo for the first 2 returns, and then a single mono return for aux3. And as far as which tracks can send what, the first 6 tracks have a dedicated knob for aux1. In this case, aux1 is a stereo reverb into Simple Touch by Synth UX Academy. This also has a delay and bit crushing effects, but I'm using it just as the reverb here. So for example, if I wanted to send my kick to the reverb, I could, or say the hats. So that's the first knob, always aux1 for the first 6 tracks. The second knob can be configured either to be sent to aux2 or to aux3. You control that using this button here, and there's a handy label here that shows you that if a track button is off, we're sending to aux2, and if it's on, we're sending to aux3. So these four, for example. So for my hats track, I'm sending out to aux2. Let's listen to that. That's basically, let's turn off the reverb. That's a stereo delay into Bastel Effects Wizard. And I tempo sync this with tap tempo. But if I wanted, I could send the hats to aux3, which is this Lead Rover distortion by Made on Earth. So I could add distortion to the hats this way. Or let's say choose my bass line here. So send that to aux3. So that would sound like this. Obviously, there's increased noise that comes with a lot of gain. And then in terms of built-in gain, you can take a listen to that. So I've got the distortion all the way down. Let's try gain on the bass. Or the kick. Or the snare. Brings in some of the noise I mentioned earlier in the snare track. So plenty of nice analog gain if you want it. I did notice some crosstalk between channels here too, regardless of the snare track. The sends, by the way, are post fader or post knob. So if I say increase the reverb, but reduce the level of the track, then nothing will be sent either. It's not that way, by the way, for the Qs. So if I mute the Q, if we were connected to the headphone output, you'd still hear the reverb. You just wouldn't hear the main bass line. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Assembler. On the pros side, it's a hands-on compact mixer with plenty of inputs and sends, especially for the size. It's simple and easy to use. Pretty much what you see is what you get, except for the gain, send, and Q choices, but that's pretty easy to learn. Once you get this, you're not going to need the manual. It has very nice gain, both with a 20 dB gain boost, and the EQs, and its connectivity is either a pro or a con depending on the rest of your gear. It has mini jacks versus quarter-inch jacks or XLR inputs on some of the mixers, so this is perfect for Eurorack and instruments with 3.5mm jacks, but you'll need adapters for other kinds of gear. Then on the cons side, connectivity-wise, obviously the inputs and outputs are unbalanced and there are no XLR mic inputs, which is a nice option to have. And then while price-wise, Assembler is actually priced relatively competitively in terms of the number of inputs and outputs, it doesn't have some of the amenities you might find in a digital mixer. For example, it's not an audio interface, there are no built-in effects, compressors, or EQ beyond the first two mono channels. There's no recall, no software remote control, and no built-in recording options. Also, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of crosstalk between at least one of the channels. I didn't do extensive testing on each combination, there might be more. So that's it for Boom Chick and Assembler. I'll upload to my Patreon samples of Boom Chick so you can listen closely to it at home. And my Patreon also has my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.